joined us. We're just going to wait a few moments just to allow people to arrive in the webinar. It just takes a few moments for people to... A lot of people joining us this morning, which is fantastic. So if you could just bear with us for a few moments while we just allow people to enter into... So those of you who are waiting, we'll be with you shortly. We're just waiting for everyone to... Well, I don't think we have everyone here. So I think we will make a start. So a very warm welcome indeed to this webinar on autism, particularly in data to help with pupil understanding, trends, action planning, and strategies to support pupils, as well as seeing the impacts of those interventions. And I'm really delighted to welcome Oliver Young, who works in the SEND department at Bede School and has done a lot of work in this field, as he will explain. There will be a chance to ask Oliver some questions, and you can do this at the bottom of the screen. To ask a question, please do so there, and if we don't answer them during the time we're chatting, then we'll leave some time at the end. Indeed, Oliver, for agreeing to come on this morning, and having such a large audience just shows how important this area is. So thank you very much for coming. So first of all, can you just give us a little bit of background about before you came to Bede's, and then your involvement at Bede's in the SEN department and with ASD in particular?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Robert. I'm a teacher of learning enhancement at Bede, so I currently work as an SEN teacher with students who have various SEN, but I have a special interest in particular in pupils on the autistic spectrum. And in my current role, I provide regular CPD and support to colleagues, both here at the senior school, but also at the prep school as well. My interest in SEN and autism specifically stems from work I've done in the past, and particularly time I spent with local authority, working as part of the inclusion and SEND teaching and learning provision, where we provided education to young people who were struggling to engage with the mainstream school system. The issues that those particular children had were varied and complex, but in many cases underlying a lot of it was undiagnosed learning needs, including autism. And that, I suppose, was a real stark indication to me of the support that these pupils need within a mainstream setting. Those sorts of difficulties arise, and what can happen if those needs aren't adequately met. So over the last 3 years at Bede's, I've become interested in how autistic individuals cope with the demands of a busy, dynamic school environment. These pupils in having the very best educational experience possible. Last year, I successfully completed the PG Cert in towards an MA with this area as my primary focus, really.
And I know that you've been looking particularly at ASD in particular. We know also that ASD can present differently in girls as it can in boys. What's your perspective on that?
I'm interested in looking at how we best support pupils with ASD and how we make reasonable adjustments to the school environments. So that's the physical environments, and also whether we need to sort of tailor pastoral care to the specific needs of this group of pupils. A large part of this, I think, is pupil voice for this particular group. We have a lot of in the form of assessments, provision maps, learning plans, and so on, but themselves, which isn't necessarily easy because often these children have difficulties with communication. But I think ACE tracking can play a part in this, because through these assessments, we're hearing more from. There are other tools that I'm trialling as well to support this, and these are things like daily diaries, pupil passports, and also self-monitoring to help build a picture of those individual pupil experiences at school, and help us to understand the challenges that they face, and also the strengths that they can draw upon as well. One of the things that we've done over the last couple of years is I've introduced Neurodiversity Celebration Week, which helps to promote kind of understanding and supportive environment among peers and the school community in general. And that, I think, has also allowed us to open up some frank and honest discussions around learning differences, including autism, but also dyslexia, ADHD, and so forth. And another thing we're hoping to do is introduce a student group that meets once a week to discuss issues that affect these pupils with learning differences. In terms of girls and boys, I'm particularly interested in looking at how autism presents in girls, and how we identify and support girls, because it's a known thing that often autistic girls can fly under the radar.
Is that due to sort of social mimicry, particularly?
They're very good at social masking or social camouflage. So they're constantly sort of monitoring their environment and picking up on what their peers are doing, and as you say, mimicking those things. So it can be quite difficult to identify those girls who are potentially having difficulties, and also the demands upon them when they're sort of in this hypervigilant state for the entire school day is potentially huge, and so it's really helping them to deal with that. We're a boarding school, and so boarding poses challenges, I think, for boys and girls on the autistic spectrum. It means social demands are high, and potentially those social demands are almost sort of 24 hours a day. Although some of them do appreciate kind of the structure of the boarding environment, and the routine involved. But girls in particular can find the boarding environment quite challenging. I think part of that is due to the kind of more complex ecosystem of female interaction that can be difficult to navigate for all girls. And I think another thing that we really need to look to do is to build in some downtime for the boys and the girls, really, to sort of recharge their social batteries and
it is
social anxiety levels back down. Sorry.
No, I'm going to say it is socially exhausting, isn't it? Having to go around in that way for that amount of time. And actually, we're going to come on, aren't we, later on, to look at some of the strategies that you've adopted to help pupils in that environment. So do you find sometimes it's very easy for those girls to go unnoticed by staff, because that's, in effect, that is what they're doing? Yeah,
it can be. I think particularly if they're quite able, quite intelligent, they're maybe very hardworking. they're very good at playing a part of being socially quite adept. So yeah, it can be a challenge to pick up those girls who are potentially struggling with the demands of maintaining that kind of social camouflage day in, day out.
And actually, one of the things we're going to come on to later is looking at over-regulating autistic pupils, which obviously has its own pressures. And it's interesting you were talking about that pupil voice, and hopefully the STEER data enables that student voice to come through. And one of the questions we sometimes get from schools, it's said it's quite common, is how they engage with the assessment itself. And how have you found that your pupils with ASD have engaged with the assessment?
So of the 22 pupils that have an autism diagnosis with us, 85% of those have reliably engaged with the assessment, which is the data that comes from the AS tracking assessment. But I mean, as we've discussed before, many of these pupils potentially over-regulating. So the software may be flagging up some of those that are it's identifying as possibly unreliable, when actually, in fact, they're just over-regulating, and actually they are engaging well with the assessment. Of the ones that of the autistic pupils I've witnessed firsthand in the assessment, they've been able to engage with it well. I think when it comes to using their imagination to imagine spaces, they often will imagine a kind of concrete space, and use that to help them navigate the questions. Interesting, actually, a couple of days ago, we had a question from a parent down at the prep school about, with concerns and questions about how their child may engage with it, and I was able to share with them the document from the resources section of the STEER website to perhaps allay some of those concerns, and we'll see how they get on with it. But yeah, on the whole, they seem to engage with it very well.
And the language that's used in the assessment is very simple, is quite simplistic and very easy for them to follow, isn't it? And as you say, they're imagining that sort of concrete environment and the boundary put around it, and they're imagining something very real, which I think really helps them actually in terms of then hearing the voice that they are able to tell us. And I think that's quite important. The document that Oliver's referring to, you can find in the resources library, it's under in the SEND file, if you want to have a look at that. In terms of your role at Bede, and I know one of the things that you have been doing in terms of the practicalities and the logistics is to look at how you're filtering your pupils on the system, on the platform itself. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how you've done that so you can pull up the data easily?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been experimenting with this in various ways, really, and I think we're still learning as we go in terms of how the best way to filter the data is, and how we can identify those groups. But one of the sort of filters we've used is to flag SEND, SEN need, and SEN gifted pupils. We've used those built-in flags in the AS tracking database. And within those, you're able to add further categories. So one of the things we've done is to flag the different SEN levels that we use here at the school. So we have levels 1, 2, and 3, which roughly correspond to their level of need, and also therefore the level of support that they receive. And within SEN need, we've also been able to categorise our autistic students and dyslexic pupils as well. So that's how we've done it so far. It's beginning to allow us to kind of compare the data for SEN pupils and the whole school population. So hopefully helping us to identify vulnerable groups and to look at the impact of certain interventions with certain groups of pupils, which is potentially very useful. So, for example, in terms of the patterns that we're beginning to see in some of these groups, the data is suggesting polar bias for trust of others and seeking change in our autistic pupils, which isn't entirely unexpected, but it does sort of allow us to perhaps target these groups of students specifically with action plans that attempt to mitigate some of that. And I also think it sort of begins to make a case for targeted CPD training for tutors of ASD pupils, because I think this group in particular have quite unique pastoral needs, and I think that pastoral support, getting that right, potentially is a key factor in their success at school. So I think the starting point for us, and this is something I'm about to put in place, is writing a group action plan for some of our autistic pupils that involves an intervention that might help address one of those polar biases. For example, seeking change, or the other one, which was trust of others, and also self-disclosure actually is being flagged up as well with some of these students. So yeah, the plan is to put in place a group action plan that allows us to do that. And I've also begun to analyse a group of year 10 dyslexic pupils, and we're hoping to sort of follow them through the year and see what the data has shown us. We've only just begun to look at this, but it's already sort of shown us perhaps some interesting trends in seeking change, which may link to some of those risk-taking behaviours that we sometimes see within this group, particularly the boys with dyslexia. So that's another interesting thing that I'm sort of hoping to look at.
Yeah, and we'll go on to look a little bit more at the action planning and strategies in a moment. You mentioned a couple of things about some of the trends you're seeing within that data, and talk about possibly girls flying under the radar and that low seeking change in some, those over-regulators. Are there any other trends that you've noticed emerging amongst that group of pupils?
Yeah, so of the 22 autistic pupils data that I've looked at, so there's approximately 40 data sets there, 35% have been identified as priority pupils, 35% were identified as having composite risks.
Is that higher than what you would expect from the rest of the school?
I think so, yeah. And there's also, some of them are being flagged up with over-regulation and hidden autonomy. And so what we're seeing in terms of the trends of the data is that firstly, the context, the school context, seems to have a greater impact on the data in girls, which I think is interesting. I think this perhaps points towards the idea that the girls are perhaps more positively influenced by the context, by the social environment than boys. But it also means that perhaps they're more vulnerable to some of the challenges that they face at school as well, you know. And so I think it does also sort of make us think, well, perhaps we need to put in some quite specific interventions for the boys so that we can influence them more within the context. So, for example, self-disclosure. The mean levels of self-disclosure in our ASD group are lower than the whole school population, which we may expect with pupils with social and communication difficulties. I think, interestingly, the girls with autism, as I said, they show an improvement in the context for this factor. So they are self-disclosing more at school, which is a positive thing, of course. Whereas with boys, it's the other way, and that this to me points towards, as I said, some intervention that we maybe need to put in place, an action plan for this group, so that we can encourage self-disclosure among the boys in particular. I think if we were to look at the whole school population, we may see lower self-disclosure within boys anyway, but I think it's more pronounced in this ASD group. Another one perhaps linked to this is trust of others. Trust of others in girls is pretty good, but in boys it's much lower than the girls group as well, which I think follows on from what I was saying about self-disclosure. I think seeking change is another area, again, where we perhaps expect more polar biases and lower scores for seeking change within the population of autistic students because of their propensity towards routine and repetitive behaviours. But the difference that we're seeing in the boys in particular, in terms of their seeking change getting lower at school, it suggests again that we need to put something in place that helps them to increase that seeking change factor. And I wonder, I wonder if that's linked to what I was saying earlier about the fact we are in a busy, dynamic school environment, and maybe we just need to prepare the boys in particular, but probably the girls as well, better for those changes and those the dynamism, I suppose, of the environment. Could we support them a little bit better with that? Girls flying under the radar, they, as we were talking about before, they appear to be more sociable. They seek more social interactions, whereas the boys seem to be happier in their own company in many cases. And I suppose what some of this data is allowing us to do is perhaps identify some of those girls in particular who don't necessarily show us the kind of stereotypical autistic behaviours that we might expect to see, that because we have those biases towards those male stereotypes of autism. But the AS tracking data is picking up some of those who may be flagged as we were saying, over-regulators, and we need to be aware of those students because they may be vulnerable to burnout because of that demand of the social kind of facade that they're putting up. And it's also making us think about some of those students who perhaps we have suspicions of or that we feel may have some autistic traits, and it's enabling us to sort of see, the data enables us to sort of see specifically what's going on there, I suppose, which is quite useful.
Well, I was going to mention that. I was going to mention it later, but actually, as you bring it up, I mean, obviously, STEER is not a diagnostic tool, and we're very clear about that. But so, in your experience at Bede, so has the data played a role when it's used amongst other evidence to highlight those pupils who may benefit from that ASD assessment or extra help?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I don't think we would use it alone as evidence for those students being potentially on the autistic spectrum, but I think it's a good initial indicator for us to perhaps look at those pupils, and then it could be a useful piece of evidence alongside, teacher and Senko observations that may be helpful for those pupils to get diagnosis, if that is the right thing for those students. And of course, that's a conversation that we would have with parents and teachers. But I think probably more importantly than the diagnosis, it perhaps allows us to to be sort of signposted towards particular strategies and particular interventions that may help those pupils who have a diagnosis, but also those pupils that have autistic traits without necessarily having a diagnosis.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, as we often say to schools that the AS tracking data is one piece of a much bigger jigsaw. And I think it's when you're putting everything together, then actually all the dots can be joined up, can't they? If I'm not completely mixing my metaphors there. You mentioned earlier about sort of using group action plans in order to help pupils. Would that be within sort of pulling groups out as a whole group, or would it be within that group action plan working individually with those, or as I say, as a group?
Yeah, well, this is something I'm sort of beginning to think about at the moment. What I'd like to do is to write a group action plan for a number of pupils with similar polar biases, and then obviously hopefully see the impact of that, both in terms of their behaviour and their well-being, but also within the AS tracking data as well. Now, what I'm thinking about is a sort of simple intervention that supports, at the moment I'm thinking about low self-disclosure. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a group, particularly a group of boys who have very low self-disclosure. And I'm thinking about putting something in place that provides a framework for them to share their thoughts and feelings about their own strengths, as well as some of the things they might find challenging. So what I'm hoping to do is to put in place a pupil passport for each of these students. And I think sort of ideally I'd like to do that in collaboration with the child, obviously, but also their tutor and their parents, so that we've got a really good picture of that student and how they experience the school day, the challenges they face, and also the strategies that they have themselves to overcome some of those challenges, and also the ways in which teachers can help them to feel supported in their lessons, or whatever it happens to be. So at the moment I'm thinking about doing this on a very small scale to see the impact that it has, and then potentially if we feel it's a positive intervention, then making it available to other students throughout the school. Another thing I'm hoping to put in place is a peer support group for pupils with learning differences. So not just our autistic students, but also our dyslexic students, students with ADHD and so forth, where they can discuss issues and work together to support each other, to propose sort of reasonable adjustments to improve their school experience as well. And I hope that supportive peer environment may also help them to share experiences, and therefore help them with their self-disclosure in a way that feels safe for them. So yeah, that's the couple of ways in which I'm thinking about putting a group action plan in place for those students.
And in terms of the individual plans, who has been writing those individual plans for pupils, and has that helped the person writing it understand the pupil a little bit more? You talked about sort of CPD for staff, and so who has been writing them? Is it the individual tutors? Is it yourself? And do you feel that's really worked in terms of that very intentional, targeted, specific help for those pupils?
Yeah, so up until this point, the tutors have been responsible for writing the action plans for all of the priority pupils within their tutor group. I would like to provide some additional CPD and additional support to the tutors of our ASD students, so that they have an even better understanding of some of the challenges that those students face, and also perhaps more of an understanding of why they're seeing some of those polar biases and some of those patterns within the data for their tutees. Up until now, it's been tutors supported by housemasters, but as I say, I'd like to give a little bit more of sort of tailored support to those tutors of children with autism.
And I'm just very conscious of time, and we're running short of time. So just two more questions from me, if I may, before asking if anyone has any questions. Have you got any particular case studies that you can share with us, anonymously, of course, about any of those interventions and the effect that that might have had on individual pupils or in as groups?
Sure, yeah. So last year I did some work with a year 10 student who was experiencing high levels of anxiety, and as a result of this was really struggling to engage with lessons. And I want to get to the bottom of this to find out what those triggers for her anxiety were, so that we could then sort of mitigate those and hopefully help her to feel less anxious. So one of the things I asked her to do as part of an action plan was to complete a daily diary. So that was an attempt to identify sort of specific sources of anxiety, and that made clear kind of 3 areas that she was finding difficult. One was sensory. So often autistic students, people in general, have sensitivities to certain sensory stimuli. In her case, it was a hypersensitivity to loud noises. And just so happened, one of her teachers would occasionally sort of out of the blue just shout, you know, as many teachers sometimes do. So, but it was the unpredictability of that she found very stressful, and so she would find these lessons very stressful because she wasn't quite sure when this loud noise was gonna come. So that was really interesting, really revealing. Secondly, the other thing that seemed to be contributing to her anxiety was the unstructured times. So times like break times and lunch times, she'd find those quite challenging. I mean, interestingly, she was very sociable. She had a really good group of friends, but she would, and she enjoyed spending time with those friends, you know, but she would worry about saying the wrong thing when she was with those friends. So that was a source of anxiety for her. And then the third thing that sort of revealed was that large scale sort of coursework assignments were a real challenge for her because of the lack of parameters and the fact that it was kind of an ongoing project that she perhaps just needed breaking down a little bit for her. So we were able to put things in place to help support in some of those things, and it did make a positive difference for her. The whole COVID situation also was a big challenge for her, and so that transition between home and school, from lockdown back into school, lockdown again, that's been a real challenge for her as well, and actually that I think has possibly had the greatest kind of impact on her ability to engage. So we're still grappling with that, and we're still supporting her with her engagement, but I think it really enabled me to sort of kind of quite clearly identify some issues, and then we were able to put things in place for her. So yeah, so she's an ongoing project, but I'm really hopeful that she will get there.
Excellent, thank you for that. And actually, my last question, you just touched on it there, is the impact of COVID on this particular group of pupils. Has it been different? If so, in what way? And are the steps you've taken to sort of help with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the uncertainty throughout the whole COVID crisis has been, I mean, it's been extremely difficult for us all, hasn't it? But particularly for this group of children. As I mentioned, being at home and back into school, that the transition of that is a real challenge for them. I think in some ways during the lockdown, being at home, out of the demands of the social environment, might have been slightly easier in some ways for them. So that social demand may have been reduced. But I also think that some of these students found it really difficult to engage with online learning and learning outside of the school context. For many of them, school is school, home is home, and it's quite compartmentalized, and that's how they're able to manage that. So as soon as you blur those boundaries, bring school into the home, I think that's been a big challenge for them. I think now that we're back into school in a more normal sense, things are beginning to settle down, but I think, you know, as I mentioned before, we're still sort of dealing with the after effects of that disruption. And there are, you know, the challenges of occasional outbreaks, perhaps, you know, occasionally staff absences, positive COVID tests, all of these things. Formal assessments, you know, having to sit formal assessments again for the first time in quite some time. All of these things, I think, are creating a higher sort of anxiety levels among all of us, but particularly for those pupils. And I think it's something we really need to continue to be mindful of.
And have you seen that in the data as well?
Yeah, I know Alex has done some analysis of kind of the before, during, and after data, after COVID data among the whole, you know, for the whole school population. Yeah, but we did several assessments at home, online, and it is interesting to see the differences there. But it very much seems to depend on the individual there, I think, in terms of how comfortable they were during lockdown at home and working within that home environment, which some of them, as I mentioned, will have found perhaps in some ways less stressful, and others will have found more difficult. So yeah, it's quite individual, I think, in that sense. But yeah, I do think in general the data has shown us that we're kind of coming out of that, but there is still perhaps some way to go. You know.
So just before I bring Trevor in, I noticed the one person talked about helping pupils to be able to understand that assessment and some of the sort of reasoning and questions behind it. And very kindly, actually, Alex has pointed people to some of the documents in facilitating assessments in the resources to how to prepare students for that particular assessment. Is that something you've done with yours?
Sorry, can you? In what sense? What do you mean?
In other words, preparing some of the pupils before the assessment for what they're going to hear and for what the assessment is about. Yeah,
I mean, I think I think we make sure that tutors are clear with their, are well informed in terms of communicating to their tutees what the assessment's about and how it works, and how to go about it in a way that allows us to get the most sort of reliable data possible. And yeah, there often are questions, and I think it's just making sure our tutors are kind of well informed and well trained on answering those and understanding themselves what the assessment's about and how it works. Yeah. And we Alex runs regular sort of CPD sessions on that, and I think in general our tutors are pretty pretty well versed in how it works. So that's really important in answering those questions.
I'm just going to bring Trevor in quickly. We've got about sort of 2 minutes in terms of if there were any questions. Trevor, have you had any questions coming through to Steer HQ there?
No, good morning, everybody. No, there were no others beyond the question with the assessment. And certainly what I would add to the discussion that's appeared on the chat is that when the pupils are actually taking the assessment, as Oliver said, if a pupil says, I'm not sure what to do, I can't imagine a space, so reassuring them in the assessment is not something that impacts the data at the end. I've certainly said to a pupil, well, this is my imaginary space. This is where I played when I was young at the field around me. And I always remember sitting down in the sunshine and relaxing at the end of playing. And that's the space that I think of. Yours may be very, very different, but there is no right or wrong. And you can support the child while they're doing the assessment. And I've found that to be very successful. So Alex, as you said, has replied on the chat. But that's certainly, it's a unique assessment in many ways, but one of them is you can support the children without actually influencing the data at the end.
And as I said earlier, actually, the pupils have this, or some of the autistic pupils have this very concrete view of what their space is. It might be their bedroom, it might be the garden, it might be a simple cardboard box. But actually that concrete visualization is in many ways quite helpful for them, I think, isn't it? And that ability to prepare them for the assessment, I think, is important. Well, we have sort of just about ended our time. So thank you very much again, Oliver, for your time this morning and for your all the preparation that I know that you've put into it, and to Bede for allowing us 40 minutes of your very valuable time. Thank you everybody else indeed for tuning in today. I hope you found that helpful, and we shall be having another webinar on a different issue next term, which obviously you were all invited to. But Oliver, thank you very much again, and to Trevor for your help, and to Fiona for setting it up, and we all hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thanks very much.